Hi guys, it's Crystal. Welcome back to my channel. I hopefully you caught my last video and that you really enjoyed it on Gordon Stewart Northcott. He was quite the crazy cat. Today, I'm going to be looking at the case of Christine Jessop. The reason being, I was actually not going to do this right at this point in time. I was going to do it later, but the reason being because of the recent discoveries they've made involving her case. So once again, I'm going to put the disclaimer that this is intended for educational and entertainment, I guess, purposes. It's just to inform people about things. If you guys want to leave comments, that's great. Maybe there's some stuff that I didn't talk about that you guys want to know, and that's perfect. Just remember, respectful comments, no hate here, because there's too much hate in the world already. Just remember to like and comment and ring that old notification bell and subscribe if you haven't already. Hopefully we can make this into something really good, guys. Like I also said, there is some triggering aspects to this case as well, because it does involve a child and a child being abused and murdered. So if it's going to trigger you, I just suggest not to watch this one. Maybe wait for a different video that's not going to trigger you. I know it's 2 child abuse cases in a row. It just happened that last week there was big news involving this case. So Christine Jessop. Now, I did try to figure out how I could work with pictures. So I figure if I use one of the pictures off my computer, you guys can see. So that's Christine right there. I hope it's not too blurry for anybody. As you can tell, she was a beautiful little 9-year-old girl. She went missing October 3rd of 1984. Before we get into her disappearance, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about her, because a lot of the times cases like this focus not so much on the victim, but on the culprit. This is a very big case in Canada. So if anybody from outside of Canada is watching, I'm just going to let you know it's a big case. I know you've heard about it in the States. It's a big case because it had been a cold case for so long. Nobody knew what had happened to Christine, but also because it led to the wrongful conviction of Guy Pomeran, not once, but twice. If you guys want to know, he was actually indicted for this crime twice, and I'll get into that. I know a lot of the times that's what we focus on is just Guy Pomeran, but you have to remember Christine as well. Christine's parents were Robert and Joyce Jessop, and they had wanted to have kids for a very, very long time. At one point in time, a doctor told Joyce that she was unable to bear children, so they adopted a son. I believe Ken was born in 1969. He was about 5 years older than Christine. So, and he did know he was adopted from the time actually Joyce became pregnant with Christine. Christine was very much their miracle baby. Like I said, doctors had told her she couldn't have kids. And an interesting part of the story was that she and Robert were in the process of adopting a baby girl anyway. The day she found out she was pregnant, actually, they called her and told her they had a baby girl for her, but she said, "I'm pregnant," so they declined to adopt the daughter. So they just had Ken and Christine. Christine was born November 29th of 1984. She was not a healthy baby, though. She was sickly, and there was a point in time where the nurses did later tell Joyce that they were afraid they were going to lose both Christine and Joyce that day because she was hemorrhaging and everything, but she did pull through. If there's one thing to remember from this, was that Christine was a fighter. She was a miracle by all accounts, and she was a lovely little girl. She was very responsible. She was business oriented. At the age of 8, she actually had a worm selling business, her own worm selling business, where she would harvest the worms and sell them to cottagers, and she made pocket money that way. Her brother remembers this very well, and she was very determined. She was playful. Everybody describes her as nice and gentle. She could be shy around other people, but there were points and times when some of her teachers described her as chatty because she was so happy to be in school. She was smart, she was resourceful, and she was a beautiful little girl. She was on the small side, just because she had been so sick. For the first 8 years or so of her life, she had gastric problems with her stomach, gastritis. Every time she ate, she would feel very sick, and so she couldn't eat a lot. Even this lasted for quite some time. So from birth until it started to subside by the time she was 8, but her parents often worried about her eating. And Joyce would say, come on, Chrissy, because they had called her Chrissy, you have to eat more. And she's like, oh, Mom, I just can't. And that was the end of it. Christine was also a child, though, who knew what the word no meant. If she was told no, she knew no meant no. So she wasn't going to keep pushing on it. She had gone to school on the 9th. She had gone to school on October 3rd. We know that she was in school that day. Her brother and her mother were going to the prison in Toronto to visit her father. No, I shouldn't say prison, I should say jail. Bob had gotten into some trouble. He was being held for commercial fraud, and I think he had an 18-month sentence that he was fulfilling. They thought Chrissy was maybe too young to go to see him at that point in time, and I don't think they wanted to take her out of school. I know there was talk that maybe that weekend she would go and see her father. What had happened was Ken and the family had lived in Toronto. Originally, they moved to Queensville when Chrissy was about 8, so they hadn't been there for too long. And when they were in Toronto, Bob had an elderly brother and sister that were family friends, and he, in essence, swindled them. They signed over their power of attorney to him, and instead of taking care of their bills, he was actually siphoning the money into his own account and paying for his mortgage then. I'm sure he felt very sorry for it, and I'm not here to judge anything that the family did. It's just, that's why you won't hear so much about what Bob did the day that Chrissy went missing. Chrissy and Ken did have a good relationship. They had a brother and sister relationship. She did like to hang around with him, and he actually he showed her how to throw a ball. She was involved with the softball team and with Brownies when they moved to Queensville. But Ken was a very good athlete. He was also described as being pretty brainy in school, but I know he won some Athlete of the Year awards, and softball was one of his games. So he said that he, quote, taught Chrissy how to throw like a man. And even though he was 5 years older than her, they did have a relationship. However, Ken was with his mother that day. Ken was 14 when Chrissy went missing. Everything was fine. That morning, Joyce had only told 3 people that they were going to be going to the jail and that Chrissy wasn't going with them. She told Bob's boss. She told a family friend, which we'll get into much later on, and there was one other person that she notified. No one else knew, because I don't think a lot of people knew that Bob was in jail, so to speak. Chrissy went to school, everything was fine. She got off the bus, according to some neighbors, and the neighbor was actually Mr. Moran, which would be Guy Pomeran's father, at 3:45. He said he could hear the kids coming off, because when kids come off the bus, you can hear a lot of chatter. So they know that she got home at 3:45. She had plans to meet up with one of her good friends, Leslie Chipman. And they were going to meet up in the park. Now, Queensville isn't very big. It's just on the outskirts of Toronto, and it would be like a very small town. So going to the park would be like a 5 or 6 minute run or walk. Christine had a bike, though, and she biked a lot of places. They did say that around 4, they were going to meet in the park. Chrissy was spotted going to get some gum, and she did pay for it, and she brought it back. By all accounts, she was on the bike, and then she took off on the bike as well. There is another girl that said she saw Chrissy's silhouette on the bike reaching her house. So I'm going to assume that she did get to go back to her house the second time. She was going to go pick up her Cabbage Patch Kids and meet Leslie in the park. She was supposed to call Leslie first, but she did not. So they did say the mail was taken in. Chrissy's book bag was on the counter, but Chrissy's bike, which was usually leaning against the big freezer in the garage, was on its side. They said that was weird too because Chrissy was highly responsible with her stuff. Now, I know a lot of you guys are going to be wondering what the heck a 9-year-old was doing on their own. You have to remember it was 1984. Joyce did know that it was illegal to leave a child under the age of 10 alone by themselves, but Chrissy was responsible, and it was 1984. It was a very small community, and she figured Chrissy would be safe. She and Ken were actually at the dentist at this point in time in Newmarket. So that's a little bit of a distance away. She told Chrissy that morning that it might not be 4 o'clock by the time they got home. They would try to be home at 4, but it might be slightly after. So Chrissy knew this. I guess she would have been allowed to go out and play. She was 9. I remember at 9, I went out and played. In the 80s, there was a lot of latchkey kids because parents worked and couldn't always be home. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind. I don't want to hear anybody blaming Joyce for these choices. It was something that a lot of parents did. So they got home. Ken and Mrs. Jessop got home at between 4:10 and 4:15, and Chrissy was not there. I know that Chrissy's friend Leslie had tried to call her a couple times and then just figured Chrissy was probably at the park. They thought it was a little weird that she didn't call them, but she just figured Chrissy was likely at the park. So she went to the park and started playing, looking around for Chrissy. Chrissy didn't show up. I know she called the house twice, so nobody answered at that point in time. So that would have been between 4 and 4:10. And Joyce did not report Chrissy missing until 7 o'clock that night. Now, she did look for her. I know she had gone out to the park and various other places. She did look for her, but she was unable to find her. She went home, made dinner, started looking for her again, could not find her. So at 7, she called the police. I keep calling her Joyce, and I'm going to have to apologize for that. I always mix her up with Mrs. Milgard. Her name is not Joyce. Her name is Janet. So once again, I apologize for that. Janet called the police, and the police came at 7. The police did not cordon off the bike. They did not dust for fingerprints. They didn't dust for anything in the house. Nothing in that crime scene was touched. Now, they may have not thought that it was a crime scene at that point in time. Maybe they thought Chrissy was at somebody else's house just playing. But they did nothing to that end. So, I know that the community was bolstered and went out and started looking for Chrissy. They tried very hard to find her. There was a report that day, a couple saw a man in either blue, green, or green, the weird color that's in between the blue green. They saw a car that color with a man who was trying to shove a little kid into the back seat. They thought it was strange and suspicious, so they did make note of it, but they did not call the police and tell them about this for 3 days. By that point in time, everybody's memory is getting a little fuzzy, and I don't think the police even investigated or took them up on that tip for 10 days later. So the investigation itself was a little botched from the beginning. Of course, they went and talked to the neighbors, and Mr. Moran would have told them that yes, he did hear the kids getting off the bike at this point in time, and there were the couple witnesses that did happen to see Chrissy, including the store clerk who sold her the gum. But she had just vanished into thin air. She was not around. I also know that they focused in on Guy Paul Moran very, very early into the investigation. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Unfortunately, Chrissy's body was found on December 31st of 1984 by a man and his 2 daughters who were walking in a wooded area about 56 kilometers away from Queensville. It's called Sunderland, just in case anybody was wondering. They were like in a field of sorts, but there was a wooded area. Anybody that's from Canada knows that there's a lot of times with fields, there will be a wooded area behind them, and she was found there. Her remains were very badly decomposed at that point in time. Her sweater was said to have been up over her head, and her legs were viciously drawn apart, and she was posed in a sexual manner. Um, I know that her pants and her underwear were found around her feet, and her prized recorder, which she was so happy to have. She loved this recorder. She had been given it the day that she disappeared, was also found next to her body with her name taped on it. So they knew that these were Christine's remains. She had been stabbed at least 5 times, and she was stabbed hard enough to break one of her ribs. She also was sexually abused. At that point in time in 1984, it was harder to tell because she was so decomposed. They wouldn't have been able to see tearing or anything like that in that area. But they did know that there were semen stains on her underwear. And they did try to isolate them for blood typing, which is what they did back then. In 1984, DNA was not really heard of. It would have been in its very, very, very infancy stage. So they used to do a lot of blood typing to figure out if you were an A, AB, O, a B, a secretor, a non-secretor. I know that at the crime site, they found a carton of milk, like a drank carton of milk, a cigarette butt, which may or may not have been from one of the officers that smoked the cigarette, and a receipt for a credit card. I think it was somebody getting gas. I don't know if the credit card receipt had a name on it. I'm going to assume it did. I don't know if there was any connection like that with the case. So poor Christine was laid to rest on January 7th of 1985. Her autopsy was done, and the family always felt that all of Christine was not there. And they went back and searched the area at one point in time where she had been found, and they were right because some of her finger bones were later found. Some of the smaller bones from her hands, possibly even her toes, were found at that spot. So they were able to recommit them with her. Now, the police did go to the funeral because a lot of the time suspects and killers will return to either the scene of their crime, or they'll somehow be involved with the family. They will go to the funeral and the wake and so on and so forth. Now, Chrissy's investigation was a little bit better at this stage. They still hadn't fingerprinted anything. Not that it really mattered because at this point in time, the crime scene was so old. They knew she was kidnapped from home. I still don't know why they never fingerprinted anything or even checked out the bike. But they did mark down license plates numbers, and they did take note of who came and went to this funeral. It was a large funeral because it was a child's funeral, number one, but Chrissy had touched a lot of lives in her short life. She had a lot of friends. She was outgoing. She was energetic. Even though she could be shy with strangers, people who knew her knew her. It was a very big travesty. Now, they centered in on Guy Paul Moran very, very early. Like I said, they were immediate neighbors to the Jessops. And actually, Mr. and Mrs. Moran were allowed to pick up Christine if they were going to, if the Jessops weren't going to be home for a period of time. They were allowed to pick her up. The school actually knew that. They had been told that 3 weeks before. But the Moran family has always been described as weird. It's always bothered me that they were described this way, but I will tell you the reasons why. Their house was kind of ramshackle. They would do some work at night during that time. Guy Paul himself was the youngest of 6 kids. He still lived at home. And at the time of the investigation, he would have been about 24, 25 years old. So for people to live back at home back then, it was really weird. And he was unemployed, or it was considered weird. He also loved music. He played the clarinet in local bands, and the police also thought that was weird. In fact, they described him in their notes as a weird type guy. Guy Paul knew Christine, but he didn't know her well. He had other interests. He was a very gentle man. He was kind. He didn't raise his voice a lot. And he was speaking in a manner that police described back then as effeminate. And if your manner was described as effeminate back then, they were suspicious of you immediately. Guy Paul did have proof, though, that he worked until 4:30 in Toronto or that he worked until 3:30 in Toronto at that point in time. He would not have been able to get home until 4:30. Now, if you'll remember from before, I said that both Janet and Ken said it was between 4:10 and 4:15 that they got home. The police pressured them into changing the timeline by saying, well, are you sure it couldn't have been 4:30? Are you sure it couldn't have been 4:30? So they then shifted their story to say that they were home between 4:30 and 4:40. That way the police said, oh, look at that. It's an open window. So Guy Paul must have taken her. Even then, I have a hard time believing this, and I have a hard time understanding how police could still focus on him if he got home at 4:30. That would have given him 10 minutes to commit this crime, to get out of his car, to go to her house, to snatch her off her bike, and to drag her out without anybody else noticing her, put her in his car, and get away. And if you'll remember, the couple that saw the car, the original, the blue-green car, or the blue or green car, said that it was also between 4 and 4:15. So it doesn't make sense. Guy Paul couldn't have been there, but the cops did not care. They focused on him. He was the person. And by this point in time, the Jessops also were convinced. Christine was wearing a necklace around her neck, and there were foreign hairs found in it. And the hairs were proven to be microscopically similar to Guy Paul Moran. Some of them were Chrissy's as well. Microscopically similar is something else that I have a problem with. Back then, you could look under a microscope and say any brown hair technically was microscopically similar. She had classmates that had hair that was microscopically similar. It was not very good science, but it didn't matter. Guy Paul Moran was arrested. He was arrested. I'm just going to check my notes for a second. In April of 1985. He was arrested in April. I believe it was April 7th of 1945. Or 1985. I don't know why I keep wanting to say 1945. It was 1985. And they held him at the detention center. Now, one of the ways that they got his hair was to actually send in an undercover officer to pretend that she was a hairstylist at the college, and she was just practicing. She was a student. So that's how they clipped the hair and got it in there. Guy Paul did actually consent to them taking blood, hair, saliva from him when he was interrogated. And the only thing he wouldn't consent to was a lie detector test. Now, you and I and almost everybody knows that lie detector tests are, one, inadmissible in court, but two, only measure respiration, perspiration, and heart rate. Someone who's innocent can fail if they're too nervous. And we all know that psychopaths can pass even if they had done the crime. So I wouldn't have put a lot of leniency on a lie detector test anyway, but back then they would have. Guy Paul went to trial in 1987, and he was acquitted the first time. A lot of people were angry about this because a lot of people very much assumed that Guy Paul Moran was the person that did this. They didn't care about anything else. And actually, when one of the police testified at his trial in 87, they said that the cigarette butt that they were using, that they were showing that this was evidence, other people were saying it may or may not have been smoked by a police officer already at the scene. All the police officers said, oh no, we don't smoke that brand. I don't know if DNA testing was ever done on the cigarette butt. I don't know if it's not actually talked about a lot. I don't know about the milk carton. I don't know if they followed up with the credit card receipt they found either. At this point in time, the Jessops were very, very angry. They said they hated Guy Paul Moran. They said it was him that did it. They knew it was him. And Bob and Janet did get divorced at this point in time. Ken had to grow up without his sister, but not only that, he had to grow up with a murdered sister. He was very upset, and he was very taken with the fact that it was Guy Paul Moran. They also claimed that in the jail cells where they were holding them, two people came forward, Robert May and a person known as Mr. X, who said that Guy Paul Moran confessed to them, and they were also witnesses in the first criminal trial. They said that he said he was going to red rum the innocent. And when they asked him what that meant, he said, well, it's from The Shining, you know, spell red rum backwards. And we know red rum backwards is murder. They claim that he said that and that he told them what he had done. Mr. May and Mr. X were both deemed as liars later on. I guess Robert May had a huge lying problem. He was basically a pathological liar. And Mr. X did later say that he made everything up. A lot of people are going to ask, isn't this double jeopardy? Now, in Canada, because he was acquitted, but it was still part of the same trial and there could have been an appeals process, it's not considered double jeopardy. It's not used very often, but the Crown was able to go all the way up to the Supreme Court and a new trial was ordered. This new trial took place in 1992. And Guy Paul Morin was actually found guilty in the second trial. He was found guilty of first-degree murder in the murder of Christine Jessop, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Here in Canada, unless you're a dangerous offender, life means 25 years without parole. I know in the States it can mean different things, but here, this is what it meant. But by this point in time, public favor was turning. No one seemed to believe, or very few people seemed to believe, that Guy Paul was guilty. It just did not make sense, especially with the botched investigation, people that had not been properly spoken to, the weird time frames, everything. So Guy Paul Morin was actually let out on bail. He only spent a total of 18 months in jail before he said, please do some DNA. Now, he had actually wanted DNA the whole time that he knew about it, from the 87 trial on. They did try to get DNA in 1989 from the underwear and in 1991, but the samples were too degraded. The technology wasn't good enough then. So it wasn't until January of 1995 that it was officially known by everyone. The genetic profile they were able to create did not match Guy Paul Morin. The second trial that took place cost $11 million in 1992 Canadian money back then. That was a huge amount. So it's another reason why this case is so big, because it costs so much money to wrongfully convict a man. He did get some compensation from the courts, but there were still people who from 1992, 93, 94, 95 onward thought that he had something to do with the crime. There were still people who claimed he had something to do with the crime. There may even still be people now that say that. So from 1995 until this year, 2020, so it's 25 years, the case sat cold. People would submit the DNA sample to our version of CODIS, and nothing ever came out. This offender was not known in the databases. He was not known in any of the prison databases, nothing like that. And everybody always wondered. A couple years ago, if you guys will remember, in 2018, genealogical DNA was used to finally apprehend the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. And in this case, that also worked here. And they were genealogically able to trace back who this man was. And this man's name was Kelvin Hoover. Kelvin Hoover was actually well known to the family. His wife, I believe, worked with Bob Jessop. But his wife, Heather, and Janet were actually good friends. And Mrs. Hoover was the family friend that Janet called that morning that Chrissy disappeared and said that she would be going to visit the jail. I believe that Heather, in passing, must have mentioned this to Kelvin, and he suddenly had a time frame. Kelvin Hoover was 28 years old at the time that he took and murdered Christine Jessop. He was more than likely the man in the car that the couple saw pushing the child into the back seat. I have no idea why that was not investigated more, but it wasn't. And it was just actually October 9th that they got the profile. And just last week, just October 14th, they were able to tell the Jessops, they were able to go and apologize to Guy Paul Morin. And they were able to tell the public that it was Kelvin Hoover. Now, they don't know a lot about his movements after Chrissy was murdered. or until now. Well, until 2015, I must say. Calvin Hoover was a neighborly acquaintance of them. He would go to barbecues, so he knew Chrissy. His kids played with the Jessop kids. He actually went to the funeral and he went to the wake, and he was involved in the search for Christine, knowing full well what he did. In fact, Janet said on the night of the wake, she could hear somebody outside her window saying, oh God, no. Things to that effect. Oh God, what have I done? They attributed it to Guy Paul Moran at the time. Although Guy Paul never went to the funeral, and I don't think he was at the wake, he did not think that it was appropriate for himself to go at that point in time. And he didn't know Christine very well. I think his parents would have known her better than he would have. And so he didn't think it was appropriate to go. However, we know that Calvin Hoover was there and that it was more than likely him saying that outside of the window. I can't say for sure because obviously I wasn't there. Mr. Hoover did die in 2015. The police did say they would have arrested him had he not been dead, but he did die in 2015, and they say it looks like he committed suicide. Not a lot is known about his movements. He did have a criminal history, but they weren't crimes that were related to what he did to Christine. They were different crimes. And that's about all that's known about him at this time. This case is huge, though. It's huge because it was cold for so long. It's huge because it led to a wrongful conviction of an innocent man. It's huge because really at that point in time, other than David Milgaard, Guy Paul Moran was the guy that we could say DNA worked with, that we could say science worked with. Like he said before, the justice system failed him, but science didn't. And with so many advances in DNA, which we know is like the holy grail of forensic testing, with so many advances, we were able to find out 25 years after Guy Paul Moran's DNA was tested and proven not to be the killer, we were able to find out finally the answer to one of Canada's longest cold cases, which was who killed Christine Jessop. It's not the longest cold case, but it is one of the most researched and most well-known and saddest, because a lot of people now just think about Guy Paul Moran, or just think about Calvin Hoover, or just think about the Canadian justice system in general when they hear Christine Jessop. They don't remember this smart, industrious, sweet, beautiful little miracle child who would have been 45 this year. She would have only been 45 this year had she lived. So hopefully you guys liked this video. I know it's shorter, but I was able to show a picture this time, and I'm looking at the camera this time. Hopefully you'll like, you'll comment, you'll subscribe, and you'll hit the notification button. And hopefully I've answered some questions for you guys. If you do have any other questions, just leave a comment. I will try to get back to them. And I hope that you guys are doing well. I hope that you guys are researching. I hope that you guys are finding clues. And I hope that you guys are going into a world that maybe you wouldn't have looked at before. And I hope that you guys will, along with the rest of Canada, remember Christine Jessop and remember what she meant to other people. So long until next time, guys. I hope you enjoy. Bye.